This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. When Russian President Vladimir Putin landed in Pyongyang June 18th, it marked his first visit to North Korea in nearly 25 years. Given Putin's predicament in recent years, the visit may not come as a surprise, but it is unprecedented. And it signals his growing desperation for artillery and allies after more than 2 years of fighting in Ukraine. Russia and North Korea's freshly signed mutual defense deal harkens back to the Cold War, and it blatantly disregards resolutions put forth by the UN Security Council, of which Russia is a permanent member. Are we watching the painfully crafted 20th century world order unravel? To make sense of Putin's visit to Pyongyang and what it means for the US and China, we're joined by John Delury. John Delury is an author, historian, and professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University in Seoul. He's currently a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. Thanks for joining us once again on Shifting Ground.
My pleasure to be here, Ray.
Well, Professor, the world is not normally beating a path to Kim Jong Un's door. Why was Vladimir Putin in Pyongyang?
Well, we can look at it from Russia's perspective and from North Korea's. I think for Putin, it was part of a tour of kind of coalition of the willing countries that he can show he's got places to visit. I mean, it is a testament to how far Russia has sunk that Putin wants to go to North Korea. He's not a regular visit there. He hasn't been there in 24 years. So from the Russian side, I think Putin is looking for some military aid, but also for some countries to visit to show that he's got diplomatic partners. And North Korea was on that stop. For Kim Jong Un, it's a bonanza. I mean, it's great to have the leader of a world power, and North Korean propaganda has gone full tilt to play up that he is still on the world stage. He's hosting a great leader in his country. So there's a lot of propaganda value for Kim. And there's also probably material support coming from Russia to North Korea. So it's a win-win for Kim Jong Un.
Quite often, it seems to the outside world like North Korea exults in its isolation, that it makes it really hard to get into the country, controls the movements of anyone who comes, is not pushing against, on most days, this idea that it does what it does for its own reasons in its own way without anybody looking over its shoulder. Does it, at the same time, crave the kind of attention, the kind of legitimacy that the visit of a foreign leader brings to a capital?
You've described it perfectly. Both things are true. North Korea, their ideology, their history is all about autonomy and standing alone against imperialism since the Korean War, which they describe as a defensive war that they were fighting for their people. So at the same time, and I would say in particular, Kim Jong Un wants to be a player on the world scene. We saw that in those years of diplomacy where he was flying on an Air China plane down to Singapore to meet with Donald Trump. He took a train, 60 hours across China to go to Vietnam to meet in Hanoi with Trump again. There were multiple summits with the South Korean leader, and of course, 5 trips to China in the space of a year. So Kim Jong Un, I would say in particular, actually craves the world stage. He wants to get out of his country. He may want to lessen some of that isolation or be open to it. At the same time, the culture of the place is deeply isolationist.
Back in the Soviet days, it wasn't unusual to see the North Korean leader, the current Kim's grandfather, in Moscow in a fur hat, smiling with members of the Politburo. Why has it been so long since Putin's last visit to Pyongyang?
Well, but if we look at the Cold War record, you're right, Ray, that the Kims, both the grandfather, the father, and now the son, they would make their trips to the Russian Far East or even as far as Moscow, which is a very long trip from Pyongyang. But it's unprecedented, actually, until Putin's first visit in 2000. The Soviet leader never went to North Korea. So Putin was the first, but then he waited a very long time to make the second trip. So this is important to understand. Again, it tells us here, I think, something about how low Putin has stooped, that it's worth his time to do this. This is not traditional for the Russian leaders to go to North Korea. It is traditional for the North Korean leaders to make the visits. And Kim Jong Un, of course, has made two in the last few years. He was there last year, and he was in Russia in, I think it was 2019, before the pandemic.
This Putin visit trails by a few months the announcement that North Korea would become a supplier for the Russian army. Is North Korea, in that regard, a handy outlet, a useful supplier?
The jury seems to be out. If we focus on, obviously, the big issue here is Russia's war in Ukraine, and to what extent can North Korea supply military aid that makes a difference in that conflict. From what I've seen, it doesn't look like North Korea is really tipping the scales. This is more about Russia cobbling together, getting what it can. I mean, if you compare North Korea's capability as a military supplier to Russia to, say, South Korea's capacity, I mean, they're in completely different leagues. South Korea is actually advancing even further in being one of the world's leading arms exporters, and indirectly is supporting NATO and the Ukrainians by helping on the back end with some of the European countries in their defense needs. So this still looks like relatively a small margin that North Korea can support, but Russia will take what it can, and it's something on the edges, and it's important enough for Putin to make the trip to Pyongyang.
Now, China has publicly, anyway, refused to be an arms supplier for the Russian war. Does Pyongyang have the freedom of movement to not get the green light from Beijing, to basically tell Xi Jinping this is what's up, and at least get the tacit approval from China, which has so far tried to remain out of the fray?
China-North Korea relations is an enigma wrapped in a mystery, because on the surface, they're treaty allies. China's only defense treaty ally, still good since 1961, is North Korea. And yet the degree of distrust and dislike in that relationship should not be underestimated. So when I see Putin visiting Pyongyang and the kind of, I think we can describe bromance, between Putin and Kim, a series of these summits, and the elevation of that bilateral relationship, there's no question in my mind that Xi Jinping is not happy. He didn't approve this stuff beforehand. This is not going according to Chinese plan. And this is actually North Korea moving way out ahead of the Chinese at a time when they are backing away a little bit from the quote unquote no limits friendship with Russia. Here's North Korea signing essentially an alliance with Russia. So North Korea, it's this kind of passive aggressive pattern that you see where they are doing things that make Xi Jinping at a minimum uneasy, and almost for sure they're doing them without approval.
Because it seems to be the great unsaid, but I'm going to say it, that over the last half century plus, Russia has moved from being the unquestioned senior partner in the Russia-China bilateral to the unquestionable junior partner. If you look at old black and white footage of Mao being forced to go hat in hand to the Russians again and again and again, the sort of high hat he's given by Khrushchev and Brezhnev, this is kind of an amazing change in fortunes for both these countries. And as you mentioned, Pyongyang has this agreement over long periods. Yes, it's difficult, it's odd, but it is a partner of China's after a fashion. It is hard to believe that all of this stuff is going on without China at least winking at it, because China is now the leader of that triumvirate, commercially, militarily, diplomatically even. It's really got heft and muscle and reach that Russia probably looks at nostalgically. Back to those black and white films of May Day parades and so on, with the brotherhood of socialist fraternal leaders all standing up there on top of Lenin's tomb. How do we understand China's role in what's going on right now?
You're absolutely right. If you know the Cold War history, the ironies of what we're watching are almost shocking to see the way in which now, under Xi Jinping, communist China, which has remained communist, having been the junior brother in the communist movement as well, is now not just the leading country among communist parties, but is the second biggest economy in the world and doing its best to sort of chase the United States for parity at that level. Whereas Russia, we discuss Russia as a rogue state. It still has the nuclear weapons and it still has the military capacity to pursue this horrific war in Ukraine. But it's on a tier down from China and from the United States, who are having this great power competition that Russia is really not at the same level. And so you see that playing out even in something like this episode of Vladimir Putin visiting Pyongyang. I mean, again, there's something almost a little sad, you could say, about it if you're a Russian nationalist, because it speaks to the way in which Russia's status has sunk, that it sort of needs North Korea. I mean, China does not need North Korea. China is being much more strategic about it. They know North Korea has certain red lines they can't cross. Meanwhile, China is busy pursuing a strategic relationship with South Korea, which is, of course, the big economy. Russia right now, Russia actually enjoyed a pretty good relationship with South Korea. This was not well understood. South Korea, the government, and as an economy, publicly, South Korea was quite slow to join the whole support for Ukraine, because there was a feeling of, Russia doesn't really mess with us. You know, they don't intervene in our elections. And
even so, it wasn't full-throated. It was sort of gradual and nuanced, that support for Ukraine.
That's right. But Russia has, we'll see how irredeemable it is, but Russia has really left in tatters now a quite good relationship with South Korea. It's just pushing South Korea further and further away. Well, what kind of sense does that make, to embrace North Korea and alienate South Korea from a bigger picture of Russia's geopolitics and geoeconomics? That's a terrible decision in the long run. Whereas China is careful to maintain as good a relationship as it can with both Koreas simultaneously. You know, so the day that Putin was in Pyongyang, China had a senior official in Seoul for strategic dialogue with the South Koreans. So again, this episode shows you how China is playing a more sophisticated game as a real world power, in a way that Russia is a brutish power on the world stage, but on a different tier than China.
Are the contradictions getting to be too much here? Can this be sustained long term? We're told, as you just alluded to, again and again, that China values international stability as it pursues its economic goals, that it was caught flat-footed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it doesn't see wider regional wars as being in its interest, and at the same time, China is interested in being a vital actor on the world stage. Does this all add up?
It's difficult. I mean, I'm in Europe now and seeing those contradictions play out, because China has really alienated European opinion over the course of this war by not doing more to at least distance itself from Russia. Recently, there was a peace conference in Switzerland. China sent no delegate. And not just the Swiss, there was just a general feeling in Europe. You saw Zelensky come out and really criticize the Chinese for pretty much the first time. So there's a real wear and tear happening in terms of European opinion. And that suggests some of these contradictions are, I wouldn't say they're unsustainable, but it's a very, very difficult position that China has carved out for itself, of wanting to stay on the fence, certainly of something like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think if they put greater effort diplomatically, they can salvage their relationship somewhat in Europe, but they would have to act in a way they haven't so far, and that would be difficult. Meanwhile, back in East Asia, the question there, of course, is Taiwan. And the Asian region is looking to China. If they want to sustain this status quo, they have to show restraint. They have to show military restraint vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis recently the Philippines and the South China Sea. And the pressure is growing whether these contradictions are things that can be lived with or ultimately prove unsustainable.
When I was living in China around the time of the 20th Party Congress, there was this growing sense in the country that the ground we're all standing on had shifted, that China no longer needed the rest of the world in the same way as it did earlier on in its rise to power and commercial vitality. Is that loss of potency in public opinion in Europe something that is really even worried about in governing circles in Beijing? Or is that all part of the Xi Jinping thought, that way of looking at the world that says, okay, well, when we needed you, we got what we needed. And now we're big enough to dictate the terms of the relationship going forward?
I am getting the sense that China's increasing unpopularity across Europe, one of its major trade partners, obviously a huge economic force, even if it's not a great military force except through NATO, that unpopularity is sinking in. There are more and more debates in Beijing about how are we going to navigate this, and it's not enough to say we're on the fence and essentially enabling Russia and Putin, that there's a real cost that comes with this. So I think the debates are breaking out, you could say. And I think that's part of a bigger point to what you described, and I observed that as well, Ray. I think there was a kind of high there that China has come down from. I think that sense of especially watching the United States falter so badly with the economic crisis and also go through a kind of tailspin in its domestic politics. Now, who knows where America goes next with its domestic politics? But that there was a moment of a notion where within China of we're unstoppable. We don't need anyone. And look at the Americans, look at them falter, so this notion of American declinism, I think they've come down from that high and come out of that a little bit. Not to say there's the old feeling of we need to learn from the West, we need to learn from America. I think that has been punctured, but I think they're now into a more complicated space. And I think that's probably a positive for everyone.
As you mentioned, you're normally based in Seoul. What do the middle-ranking economic powers, the people we used to call the tigers there around the edge of East Asia, as they're watching giants tussle, what do the Philippines and the Vietnams and the Thailands and the South Koreas, how do they handle themselves in this very fraught moment?
Well, it's hard to generalize because each one of those countries you mentioned and the others have, first of all, complicated domestic politics. So there's usually two sides to the China question within each country. And then they're all on their own trajectories of figuring out, do we need to push back more against Beijing right now and get the Americans on our side? The Philippines is probably in a place like that, for example, right now. Or do we need to cool the temperatures? Do we maybe even need to signal to the Americans, hey, look, we don't want to fight out here. We want Taiwan to be Taiwan, but we don't want a war in the Taiwan Straits. That's probably where a South Korea is, or even Japan at this point. So what I see in the region, in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, as the Americans like to call it, is a lot of oscillation, oscillation along that spectrum, but with deep, deep concern about the U.S.-China rivalry. There's a famous proverb, it's almost a cliche in Korea that's been used for centuries, that when the whales fight, the shrimps are crushed and killed. And that sense of we got to make sure, do what we can to avoid the whales fighting, that's a real thing. That's a palpable thing across the region.
When you talk about differences, at the same time, is there kind of a reappraisal of the United States for all the difficulties of past history? And they are many. We could do a whole separate program on them. Does America look like a partner that has interests, but won't come in and seek to own your country or control your internal politics. Given the rise of China, if you're sitting in, I don't know, Hanoi, Bangkok, are you looking at this and saying, as I'm watching the Belt and Road play out, as I'm watching debt problems across the Indian Ocean and in East Africa play out, there were problems with the Americans, but it's not to say that China is an uncomplicated good either.
For sure, there are deep misgivings about a future in which China has increasing leverage, starting with economic leverage, but then expanding into, we already see diplomatic leverage, potentially one day, sort of internal political leverage. I mean, so far, we haven't seen a lot of that. We haven't seen Beijing trying to tip the scales of elections across Southeast Asia. Certainly, they're not trying to support communist parties, which was the old playbook. So at that level of internal politics, I think that it's maybe more of a wash when you're looking at the competition between China and the United States. But the concerns are really deep across the region, and it's changed about what a all-powerful China means for them, because it's right there. You need their trade. You need to keep the economic relationship open if you're in Asia. But there is a newfound appreciation for America as a countervailing force. That's very safe to say. Now, of course, the Trump years really destabilized that, because America elected a president who was openly denouncing the very alliances that were the ways in which these countries could rely, many of them on the United States. So it's a mixed bag on looking in the other direction. But certainly with China's step-by-step dominance, the value of the United States went up across the region.
Even absent Donald Trump, is there worry in Seoul or Tokyo or Manila, and conversely, delight in Beijing and Moscow, that the U.S. is bogged down in domestic politics over foreign affairs, distracted by Gaza, inside Washington battles over keeping supplies flowing to Ukraine, and isn't fully invested in watching East Asia?
For sure. East Asian countries, pretty much across the board, want America to have its act together. And when they see the kind of dysfunctionality coming out of Washington or American, gridlock and politics sort of veering this way and that, the region is not happy. And for sure, Putin is conversely quite happy. I would put China somewhere in the middle. I don't think that Beijing wants a destabilized the United States, at least not at this point in this step. I mean, again, there is still that Chinese desire to make the most of this run, because they've had a great run and they're still making a great run in the status quo kind of order that we have. So I think China is somewhere a little bit in the middle, looking issue by issue where it's helpful for them when the United States is stymied and dysfunctional, but not wanting a kind of system crash in a way that probably Vladimir Putin would be very happy to see.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. Is there a set of conditions, given the way, the turbulence of the current moment, that North Korea becomes something more like a normal country? Or is that, given the dynamics of today's situation, just kind of off the cards, just not going to happen?
I think there was a window there in 2018 with all that engagement we saw between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, as well as opening up the channel with the United States. Kim Jong Un visiting normal countries like Singapore and Vietnam and having bilateral meetings. That was generating some really positive momentum in the direction of what you describe as a kind of normalization process for North Korea. The kind of process that countries like China and Vietnam, for that matter, went through to great success for their people in pure economic terms. Right now, Ray, honestly, that seems to be receding. It's quite discouraging to see Kim Jong Un make a decision to go with Putin and see how much he can get and how far he can go with that relationship, because that is really linking the North Korean train to a pariah state, essentially. And so right now, those hopes of kind of luring North Korea back on a more normal path, they're harder to put stock in. But in the longer run of history, it's still my hope that that's what an enlightened diplomacy can do one day down the road.
Because it's really hard to see any of this benefiting the 25 million North Koreans. They are sometimes even lost in this conversation because of this one-man show that's being run out of Pyongyang. We don't, from all I've heard, seem to be in the kind of episodic, dangerous deprivation that sometimes plagues North Korea, but that's not to say that things are great there either.
No, things are not great. You have significant parts of the population on subsistence level, and that's a structural issue for North Korea. They basically can't feed themselves. They need, external trade. They need all kinds of investment to get their infrastructure in a place where they can have kind of a functioning modern economy. And you're right, that's the real tragedy of this, that some 25 million people are essentially trapped in there. They can't travel. They can't trade freely. They can't benefit from the dynamism in the region all around them. To me, that should be the objective that drives new thinking about the diplomacy. Our diplomacy has been fixated on one thing, which is denuclearization. How do we prevent them from getting nuclear weapons? How do we, restrict their development of nuclear weapons? How do we convince them to give up this arsenal? That would be great. We can keep it on the table, but we are so far from that goal. And in the meantime, the policy lever we go back to is, let's put more sanctions on the North Koreans. Well, guess what? That's not good for 25 million people who are stuck in there looking for some kind of opening. And so there's a real tragic, in a kind of Greek sense, tragic policy level to all this, where the only thing we can think to do is to almost increase the isolation that's probably the worst element in the whole conundrum.
Yeah, but it's hard to know what else to do with a country that's not commercially tied to the rest of the world or the international banking system or the normal wide view international diplomatic relations. What do you do with a state that seems to have no restraint, that acts at will in shooting missiles all over the region, was happy to have become a nuclear power, even though there was a lot of upside to them not doing it, and now goes about its business raising funds for its central government by becoming, international gangsters, in effect, penetrating computer networks, perfecting ways of theft through international computer networks. A country that's totally unrestrained by the enticements of normal relationships with the rest of the world is kind of a tough place to have as a neighbor or a friend.
For sure, you're right. There's no silver bullet on this one, and North Korea has stymied, generations of policymakers. But if we look at the recent past, if you look at the window in 2018-19, when there was, for all its craziness, Donald Trump, in my view, did get that one thing right of talking to Kim Jong Un. The South Koreans were able to really backstop that in a more serious way and do a lot of engagement across the DMZ. How did Kim Jong Un respond in that period of time? He declared a moratorium on missile testing. The missile testing stopped. He said, all right, I'll blow up the mountain where I do the nuclear tests. He detonated the areas in the bottom of this mountain where they test their nuclear weapons. So we did see improvements. It's going to be a very long game. We're talking about it's going to take decades. But I think we do have evidence, even from the Kim Jong Un era, that when there's really high-level, serious efforts to engage him, to kind of normalize him, to treat him as normal, you can start to bring North Korea down the path that we're talking about and away from the path that they're on. So I think in the long run, it's the only shot we have. But it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to take a long time.
The thing about the long run, when you're talking about North Korea, is that it's likely even if it's not Kim Jong Un, and there are periodic rumors about his ill health and who's standing behind him, ready to take over. But there'll probably be somebody from the Kim clan in charge, and there'll be somebody different in charge down the road in Washington. Would a Trump victory in November make much difference, really, or is it just in the visuals of this relationship? Are there concrete differences in the Biden world approach and the Trump world approach to an unpredictable, stable at the top, but really unstable place like North Korea?
Well, you're right to flag this issue of our transitions and our changes of government. I mean, we've actually zigzagged ourselves in terms of how we treat North Korea, and the same is true in South Korea. That's how democracies work, and that's fine. But looking forward, I, for one, would hope to see in a second Biden term the kind of real diplomatic push that they didn't do in the first term on North Korea. I think they could do it with a seriousness and in an organized fashion that could get us somewhere. And I think that Kim Jong Un, whereas when I imagine what a Trump 2 looks like vis-a-vis North Korea, it reminds me of the line by Karl Marx that Hegel was right, history happens twice, but he forgot to add it's the first time tragedy, second time farce. You can imagine, just like Putin getting the red carpet treatment in Pyongyang, you can imagine that happening with Donald Trump, and he tweets after he leaves, I fixed it again, but just all pure theater, pure theater. And that's not going to get us anywhere. So I'm not very optimistic in a serious way about what another Trump try at this could do. I'm concerned that the Biden administration is not willing to really put in the work that it takes on North Korea to get somewhere. But I think if they did, they have a much higher chance of some real success.
Well, you wrote an article earlier this year called "A Solution on North Korea is There If Biden Will Only Grasp It." Things move fast in this part of the world. How's it looking now, later in the same year, post-Putin visit to Pyongyang? How does the premise that you laid out, a roadmap for the Biden operation, look now?
Well, if the president read the op-ed, he didn't take my advice, but, I'm not the first professor who's complained about that. I thought of that article, which was a few months ago, and thought, okay, if he had done what I said, which is very high level, Biden himself announces a special envoy, that wants to resuscitate the process with North Korea. Counterfactually, if that had happened, would we not have seen Putin make his trip to Pyongyang? No, I don't think so. I think probably this trip's been in the works for a while, and North Korea has a lot of reasons, as we've discussed, for why it makes sense for them to host Putin. But if my advice had been taken, it would be complicated because the Americans would be talking to the North Koreans too. Kim Jong Un would be using this relationship with Putin to then kind of dangle some carrots with the Americans. Well, hey, look, you see, I'm getting close with the Russians. But if you're willing to do something, then I'm willing to not do something. I'm willing to maybe not supply them with particular kind of armaments that you're very concerned about. And we know the North Koreans will play that game because they've been playing that game since they started. They played that game playing Communist China and the Soviet Union off of one another for the entire Cold War. And they've played that game, tried to, with the Americans and the Chinese. I think they would play it with the Russians. So I stand by the op-ed. I hope that when, if it is a Biden administration and they get a second turn at bat, they reconsider the way in which they've been ultimately pretty reactive and passive on the North Korea issue. Maybe if they have some diplomatic political capital going into a second term, someone can dust off that essay and give it some attention, because I think the underlying logic, which is that, first of all, we're not going to fix this with more sanctions. We've got to figure out a way to engage the leadership in North Korea and also bring out the people in North Korea and the economy. That Kim Jong Un wants to do that. And part of why he wants to do that is his own geopolitical balancing game with China and Russia. And therefore, he will be open to the United States channel. I think that logic does still hold now.
Let's spend the last few minutes talking about the international order. I'm wondering if there's a kind of ad hocery to 2024 that is making it into a strictly bilateral world, a strictly contingent world where longstanding alliances, longstanding commitments to international problem solving just isn't looking so hot or so vital right now. Whether it's Putin going to Pyongyang, regardless of what Xi Jinping thinks about it, the UN Security Council being ignored in this sort of overt hi hat kind of way, is the painfully cobbled together international order of the second half of the 20th century unraveling.
You do have that feeling that things are falling apart. I'm here in Switzerland, and Switzerland just tried to hold a conference for peace for Ukraine and couldn't get the Chinese to show up. And this is on the anniversary of the Geneva talks in 1954, where France and Britain had to convince the Americans to let the Chinese show up, the communist Chinese, and the Russians were there as well. And there were a series of efforts at that high level of international politics to develop the international system through the United Nations, but also with kind of great power symmetry. And we're certainly not seeing that now. What we're seeing instead here in Europe, we're seeing blocks. I mean, NATO is alive and well, and of course, Sweden and Finland are joining, and the discussion is bringing in others, ultimately Ukraine, conceivably. So we have that return of at least blocks. Out in Asia, I think it's a different story, as you described. It's a little bit of each man for himself, with China and the United States way up there at the heights, and everyone kind of worrying, how do we navigate those two great powers? So that's just two parts of our complicated world. But I would say the complexity is increasing, and the internationalism and the cooperation, that muscle feels particularly weak at the moment that we're in right now.
There was a period here in Washington where the Biden administration was behaving as if sails were full. International compacts were being revitalized. America's participation on the world stage was being very kind of retro and nostalgic, but rejoining the world. And the president himself said, America's back. And there was at the same time, a kind of sarcastic, self-satisfied look at Russia's problems, saying, oh, all right, fine. Maybe they're willing to throw their weight around in the world, but look at who their friends are. Venezuela, North Korea, Iran. It's a pariahs club. It doesn't have staying power. Would Americans be missing something vital about what Russia and China are doing in the global South if they stick to that self-satisfaction about this new alignment, let's call it?
I do think that there's something missing the moment we're in for the Biden administration, even if it's at the level of language, but the language matters, to try and draw upon this nostalgia and to use the language of the post-1945 international rules-based order, which historians would say, What is that exactly? Because that's not what I see when I look at how it really unfolded. And this kind of nostalgia for 1990s unipolar, America, leader of the free world, everyone coming our way, end of history. I think that whether it's Joe Biden or his advisors or whoever it is, the United States, the foreign policy language of the United States needs to think about a future vision in which it is not the center of the world, which is still what most of this language kind of implies. A language that gives a lot more agency to everyone else. I do think that is lacking. That's been lacking in the last few years, and that's maybe something to reflect on for the future.
So what will you be watching in the 4 months between now and November, the 6 months between now and the end of the year? What should people who are interested in, worried about the international situation be looking for?
Well, I'll stick to Asia. And if we focus there, I think that the typical list of the hotspots, the flashpoints, South China Sea, there's been this incident between China and the Philippines, Taiwan, of course, East China Sea, where China and Japan can get into it, and then the Korean Peninsula. I'm, for the imminent future, for the next few months, I'm not particularly worried that we're going to have a third war breaking out. Things seem to have weirdly settled down a little bit. I mean, in a funny way, Putin's visit to Pyongyang makes me a little bit less concerned that Kim Jong Un is going to suddenly run off and start a war with South Korea, because at least he's got something now. He's got a game. I can say that what people in those countries, in the region and here in Europe and everywhere, I mean, the eyes are on the United States to see what happens with this election. And so there's going to be a lot of hedging strategies until that's decided. And then I think we'll see more decisions for good and for ill coming after November, once the world kind of knows which direction the United States is going. Now I sound guilty of the narcissism that I just critiqued, but you do hear that wherever you travel, that people don't know which way America is going to go. So I think that the other one I would say is I want to see where China moves on the Ukraine war. As I mentioned at the outset, I do get the sense that there's a real internal debate and that there may be a recalibration going on in Beijing. And so I'm curious to see if China makes some moves to distance itself a bit more from Russia and maybe repair some of the damage in Europe. And that would happen independent of American politics, but it would have to happen relatively soon.
John Delury is a professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University in Seoul. Thanks for joining us once again on Shifting Ground.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.